One of the most fraught issues today in Jewish life is what is seen as the growing tension between American Jews and Israel. As Howard pointed out, almost every day something new pops up in the news. After we settled on this morning, just almost for the fun of it, I watched more carefully as I go through the 2 or 3 blogs and news websites that I go through, and literally almost every day there was something. Some of it very significant. So Natan Sharansky and Gil Troy made their proposal and Mosaic's lead article of the month, and that's eliciting reactions. And all of the people that you expect to sign in are signing in: Daniel Gordis, Hillel Halkin, Elliot Abrams, Alan Arkush, Yitzchak Herzog, the new chair of the Jewish Agency. There's a new center at Bar Ilan University to deal with it. Moment Magazine asked 4 or 5 or 8 people how we should teach our young about Israel. As soon as the nationality law was passed, at least 3 major American Jewish organizations within 6 hours had something to say about it. 2 were opposed, 1 was in favor. Their comments are predictable. It's gotten to the point now that also both in Israel and in America, they're talking about how Israel might help, believe it or not, to fund American Jewish education. And then, of course, Dov Waxman reminded us that there is trouble in the tribe. Whether or not we agree with his analysis of that trouble, it would seem that there is trouble in the tribe. What was thought to be the cement that unified Jews, despite their differences, now is becoming, it would seem, a wedge that sunders us apart. And a large piece of it is the distancing, the term that is now used, between American Jewry and Israel. The data aren't all that clear. And even when we see the numbers, there are small differences in this study and that study. And the data are often hard to interpret even when they do seem clear. Let me just give you 2 examples of how difficult it can be sometimes to interpret data correctly. Both are from one of the best studies done, the Pew Foundation. They know how to do research. In their recent question, they asked, or their recent survey, is there a way for Israel and an independent Palestinian state to coexist peacefully? Now, that would seem reasonably straightforward. But some people may read that, well, is there any way that might come about in which that could be possible? And other people might read that, in today's reality, is there a way for it to happen practically? And therefore, some of the people who say no are disagreeing, and some of the people who say yes are disagreeing, and sometimes the people who say no and the people who say yes are in fact in agreement. Or another question in the same study. This was an odd finding. Was Israel given to the Jewish people by God? Now, among the ultra-Orthodox, as they termed them in the study, 81% said yes, 13% said no, and 4% said they don't know. Now, I'm not surprised about the 81%. But what about the 17% of ultra-Orthodox who aren't sure? Well, was Israel given to the Jewish people by God? Do they mean the land of Israel? Do they mean the state of Israel? Do they mean under all circumstances forever? Do they mean following a period of exile? Depending on what they have in mind, they may answer the question differently. And so the research in some ways is ambiguous. Also, the issue isn't new. We have to remember that before 1948, there were more non-Zionists than Zionists in America. And soon after 1948, Jacob Blaustein and David Ben-Gurion had their famous correspondence in which Blaustein made it absolutely clear that at most American Jews would give some donations and maybe every now and then a word of encouragement. but that any other links proposed between the two communities were off the boards. Ben-Gurion, of course, didn't follow through on that completely, as one might have expected, but the point was made and the argument was conducted. A lot of that was changed, of course, in 1967, for reasons that we all understand and I won't take time to elaborate. Then in 1975, when the United Nations General Assembly passed its Zionism is Racism resolution, Zionism took on a new meaning among American Jews when Max Fisher, then the leading non-Zionist official in American Jewish life, appeared with a big lapel button that said, "We are all Zionists." The new attention to the Holocaust that sort of blossomed in the early 70s, together with the threat of 1967, called a new reality to the minds of American Jews, and Israel's role in 67 in defending itself, again established a different image of ourselves among us. Then in 1988, a magazine no less significant than Commentary invited some of the leading thinkers of American Jewish life to reflect on American Jewry and Israel and what the relationship was. The lead to that symposium sounds very familiar. Never, perhaps, has criticism of the state of Israel by American Jews been so open, so widespread, and so bitter as it is today, they said in 1988. So the issue isn't entirely new. Not only is it not entirely new, but, for example, in the NJPS, the National Jewish Population Survey of 1990 found the 13% of American Jews celebrated Yom HaAtzmaut, only 13%, even though 25% had close friends and family in Israel, and 23% had been to Israel themselves. When asked how emotionally attached to Israel they were, 10% said extremely, 18% said very, 42% said somewhat, and 30% said not at all. Now, I'm not sure that's comparable with any figures today that use the very same words, even though in research methodology, of course, we want to keep the question constant so that we can compare populations. Because although the wording of the question remains constant, as I pointed out, the meaning of the question, the cultural definitions of those crucial adjectives, extremely, very, somewhat, not, may change from generation to generation. The fact is, though, that there are too few people who would write, as Albert Einstein did in declining the presidency, "I am deeply moved by the offer from our state of Israel, and at once saddened and ashamed that I cannot accept it." It is the sense of our. It is the sense of our, of identity, that we want to examine. It's an old problem, but it feels somewhat different today. And though the data are ambiguous, as my brother-in-law, the doctor, says, always listen to the patient. Whatever the tests show, listen to the patient. It would seem there are two folk maxims that have to guide us. One is, there's nothing new under the sun. The other is, you can never throw a rock in the same stream twice. Everything is always the same, and everything changes. Many of the issues that concern American Jewry in Israel are inherent in Zionism itself. The place, the role of Israel, and of diaspora in Jewish life. How each ideally should, can, help, influence, be concerned with the other. On the one hand, there is no representation without taxation. On the other hand, presumably we are two branches of the same historic people. Bavel and Yerushalayim, an old issue, but a new one. The involvement usually depends on whose ox is being gored. As I read most of the explosions that appear in the press, If American Jews are agreeing with Israelis, or Israelis are agreeing with American Jews, well then of course we ought to speak to one another, about one another, on all of our common issues. If we are disagreeing with one another, then we are really two separate communities, and one has to respect the distinction and the local autonomy. It seems clear that the relationship is weaker than what we want. And that can cost both American Jewry and Israel dearly. Now, it seems there are certain sociological principles that ought to undergird our approach to trying to understand. The first is a principle of multiple causation. Nothing important is ever due to only one cause. You always need a set of conditions to come together to make something happen. There is not one factor that will always bring about a significant result. Secondly, motivations are always mixed. At the individual level, nobody ever does anything for one reason only. There are economic considerations, benefits, costs. There are psychological considerations, some of which we don't even know because they're subconscious, but they push us around. There are social considerations, the company we keep and the people whose reactions are important to us. There are ideological considerations. We want some sense that what we're doing is right. And they all merge. We may focus on one or another in a particular conversation or in a particular reflection, but if we want to examine what brings about changes, attitudes, behaviors, we have to understand that motives are mixed and come in packages. The same thing is true about a collective, an organization, a synagogue, a political party. Attracts to it people for both intrinsic and extrinsic reasons, both what it says it is for officially and the other benefits of joining, of being a member, of hanging out with them. There are many factors that attract people to an institutional setting or to an event. And that institution, that organization, that event reflects that mixture of motives. But it's not only what officially it claims to be about. Not only does the Prime Minister try to keep his coalition together, but I would guess there are a lot of rabbis in America who are busy keeping their coalitions together as well for the same reasons. People are attracted to them and to supporting them out of a variety of motives, and they have to keep enough of them in place to maintain their positions. Another principle is that people work in alliances. Collectively, groups get together over some issues that divide them over other issues. One of my favorite stories recounts that Natan Sharansky, once meeting with a group of conservative and reform rabbis, complaining about non-recognition in Israel, turned to the conservative rabbis and said, "Will you recognize their," pointing then to the reform rabbis, "conversions?" And there was a very difficult moment when everybody was hemming and hawing. But they were a coalition and alliance for some reasons. They would not be for other reasons, and that always happens. The same thing is true with individuals. We don't want to be completely alone. We want to associate with certain ideals and certain causes and certain perspectives, and that often requires certain kinds of compromises. The final principle that has to underlie anything we think about is the notion of the definition of the situation. Simple English words, probably one of the most important concepts in sociological analysis. William I. Thomas and Dorothy Swain Thomas together formulated the axiom, if men define a situation as real, it is real in its consequences. That is, even if it may not be real, it might as well be, because in its consequences, it is as if that were the case. We don't react to the situations we're in. We react to the way we define them and the way we understand them. And therefore, what we really need to know is what has come to be called the plausibility structure. What are the ideas, the concepts, the values that we sort of take for granted that frame our thinking? Now let's go back to American Jews in Israel. One of the theories that we hear is, don't worry, the young are always less attached. They'll grow up, they'll join, we'll all be all right. There are a few problems with that. The first is that memberships generally, organizational affiliations generally, are declining. They're not in place. They will not be in place the same way for the young to join. Secondly, with each generation, we get further away from the personal memories that inform our thinking. We get further away from the experiences of the mid-20th century, of 48, of 67, of 73, of the mid-80s, and so on. And that does make a difference. What we learn in history cannot have the same impact as what we live through. And finally, even if data can be brought to show that, gee, you compare the Orthodox today with the Orthodox then, earlier the conservative today with the conservative earlier, not that much difference. And the data can show that. Nonetheless, the population is moving. Those who are just Jewish, no other identity, are growing, as the others are declining, except for Orthodoxy, which is at least numerically holding its own, and in a generation or two, if things continue, will grow. So if group by group there isn't a difference, there's movement among the groups that suggests decline. There are two main theoretical approaches. One is that it's due to the differences between American Jews and most of Israel politically. The liberal conservative theory that American Jews more likely favor liberal policies of economic equality, civil equality, the notion that everything can be solved if only people are willing to give things up, a kind of automatic defense of the underdog, a kind of mistrust of power to begin with. And they hear that from the pulpits as well. The second theory is that it has to do with weakening Jewish identity, that Israel is simply part of the package. And as Jewish identity becomes thinner, as it becomes less compelling, as it becomes less a part of life, Israel's attachment also declines. It's not only distancing from Israel, it's distancing from Jewish practice, Jewish study, Jewish feeling, Jewish life. Now, there may be some truth to both of those. Can we tell which of the two is more important? The fact is we can. We can do correlation analyses, and indeed both are correlated with general support of Israel, but then we can add the notion of partial analysis, partial correlation. I ran two quick numbers. If you take three variables, attachment to Israel, however we measure it, religious movement in America, Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, just Jewish. And although I know that in theory this is not the case, in practice, every study that has been done shows that on every measure of Jewish involvement and identity, the Orthodox get higher scores than the Conservative get higher scores than the Reform, and the Reform get higher scores than the just Jewish. On every measure, not only ritual observance, not only Shabbat, not only kashrut, not only synagogue attendance, but support of Jews around the world, going on the website to find out things Jewish, whatever measure one uses, it is the variable that predicts most every time in every study that has been done. So, I'm not suggesting it's cause, maybe it's consequence, but the correlation holds. Taking movement, attachment to Israel, and whether one defines oneself as liberal or conservative. If you take, as Israel, in the American Jewish Committee study of 2015, if you take caring for Israel as part of being Jewish, movement, and political position, when you do it with movement holding political position constant, the correlation is 0.237. When you do it with political position holding movement constant, it's 0.083. That becomes even more dramatic in the most detailed study of Israeli attitudes that's been done, the study that Stephen Cohen did for the Bronfman Foundation in 2007. If you take attachment to Israel and political position holding movement constant, you get 0.044. That's as if there's no relationship at all. If you take tied to Israel with movement holding political position constant, it's 0.450. That's significant. In other words, it is not the political position that's doing the work. It's the overall involvement in Jewish life. And it would seem that almost every study seems to show that. Now, as I say, in order to understand that, we have to try to put it in context. We have to try to identify the framework, the underlying themes and values. I'd like to make a couple of suggestions. One is an idea that Bethany Horowitz formulated in her study of the Jews of New York a number of years ago. Bethany. She said that most Jews in America these days conceptualize Jewishness as a salad bar. What do you do at a salad bar? You take whatever you want? It's all there. You want a little of this, you take a little of this. You want a little of that, you take a little of that. You want a little of everything? By all means. You want only one item? By all means. You're not supposed to walk away with an empty plate. But how much you take and what you take is entirely up to you. Jewishness is an anthology. You dip in, you take a little of this, a little of that. It's all good. That, of course, is relativistic. It's pluralistic. It has no borders. It is totally subjective. Everything is fine. Everything should be recognized as legitimate. It's what Herbert Gans calls symbolic ethnicity. It doesn't really shape our lives. It doesn't really shape our lives. It's a few items here and there that we pick out that we use to identify ourselves. Now, how does one reconcile that with the notion that most Jews who approach the salad bar will still tell you that their Jewishness is very important to them? Again, I often wonder whether it's the Jewishness that's very important to them, or whether it's the right to choose to be what you want to be. In other words, is it very important that I'm Jewish? Is my Jewish character what shapes my life? Or is it very important to me to be able to be whatever I happen to be? And since everybody once has to be something, I happen to be Jewish, and my right to do that is what is very important to me. Again, it is one of those questions that could be interpreted in different ways, because it's very hard to imagine a position in which being Jewish is very important to someone, and yet, as someone once remarked, an anthropologist could follow him around for 3 months before discovering that he really is Jewish. On the other hand, that tends to leave people unsatisfied. If nothing is compelling, if nothing is worthwhile, if it's all fine, choose whatever you want, a little of this, a little of that, somehow, for some reason, that doesn't satisfy the human being. And so he looks for something that is essential, that is necessary. And what American Jews have come up with is social justice, which translates into political liberalism. And that, by the way, is also not new. In 1957, in one of the earliest studies of a Jewish community, Marshall Sclair's study of Lakeville. Lakeville is a suburb of Chicago. Highland Park, as a matter of fact. He did a very well-known and often quoted little piece called The Image of the Good Jew. He asked people, in your opinion, for a Jew to be considered a good Jew, which of the following must he do? Which are desirable but not essential, which have no bearing on whether or not you consider him a good Jew, and which must he not do? And he gave him a list. The one that got most votes, 93% saying it was essential, lead an ethical and moral life. Now, I'm not denying that that's an important part of being Jewish, but it clearly outranked things like contribute to Jewish philanthropy, support Israel. Support Israel got only 20% as essential. 32% said it makes no difference to being a good Jew. Support all humanitarian causes, 67%. Belong to a synagogue or a temple, 31% said it was essential. One goes on and on like that. Promote civic betterment and improvement in the community, 67%. Help the underprivileged improve their lot, 58%. Marry within the Jewish faith, 23%. It goes on like that. In other words, that is not new. This is not new. And the most recent Pew study asking Jews what was very important, again, the ones that came out on top, in addition to remembering the Holocaust, leading an ethical and moral life, working for justice and equality. That is the study that very famously reported that 42% of American Jews said that it's essential to have a good sense of humor to be Jewish. I don't know how many of them were laughing while they gave that answer, but I suspect more than the serious people who reported the results. Milton Himmelfarb pointed out years ago, and Norman Podhoretz then expanded it into a book a few years ago. He said, for religiously liberal Jews in America, the essence of Jewishness, the essence of Judaism, is social justice or political liberalism. He said that's the only way you can explain them. Because why would they vote against their own interests? And if in fact social justice is the key element in Judaism, then you'd expect the Orthodox to vote even more so a liberal line. Now, you can't deny that social justice is an important part of Judaism. The sources are clear, and the precedents are clear, and we can bring all the footnotes you want to support it. But for that to be the essence of Judaism and everything else to be voluntary, everything else to be optional, everything else to be on the salad bar, suggests that a liberal political perspective becomes the expression of a religious commitment. And therefore, people are willing to vote against their own interests. You see, for a religious principle, you're willing to give something up. Why aren't the Orthodox equally liberal? Because they work out their religion in a religious mode. And when they turn to politics, they behave like political people. They vote their interests. So some are more conservative, some are more liberal, some make this assessment, some make that assessment. And most of the data show that the Orthodox in America vote the way most other Americans of similar socioeconomic status vote. They make the same kinds of calculations, the same kinds of ranges. They come out within a few percentage points of other Americans making the same judgments because they vote politically. Non-traditional Jews, religiously non-traditional Jews, express their religious commitment through their politics. And therefore the politics becomes not just a matter of interest, but a matter of principle, of commitment, of religious ethics. Today that means fighting power wherever it is. It means being part of a progressive alliance, whatever it stands for. And perhaps the most dangerous thing for them, for us, and for the world is it means increasing polarization. The ability to see on the one hand, on the other hand. On this I agree with you, and on this I disagree with you. Let's work together when we can, and disagree civilly when we can. There is much less of that. I'm not sure about Israel. I'm privileged to be here the little bit that I am. But in America, it is almost impossible to have an intelligent conversation on anything political. You are either on one side or you are on the other side. I have taken a vow. I literally do not discuss politics in social settings because I can't possibly. There is simply no way to say, well, this was right, but this was wrong if it's within the same context. There is either all good or all evil, all justification or all destruction. That kind of polarization, driven by, again, social justice and the need for affiliation, among those whose commitments are not rooted in religious commitment leads to a very serious and unfortunate situation. What do we need to do? What do we need to know? It seems first that somehow we have to begin to give thought to how we should develop the Yerushalayim-Bavel relationship. What's the right way to do it, in principle? Not just, well, if you agree with me, you have every right to speak, and if you disagree with me, you ought to mind your business. That has been the theme of the last several decades on both sides. But what for the Jewish people, for what the Jewish people ought to try to achieve in history, what it ought to try to contribute to history, what is the right way for these two communities to interact? Much more thought, systematic, careful thought has to be given to that. Because unless there is a compelling vision, there's simply going to be a continuation of the argument. If you agree with me, well, you have every right to speak, and if you disagree with me, shut up, you're not part of my community. That is going to be the default unless we do better. Secondly, we have to do research in depth about the framework that encases the ideas that people express. It's so easy to do survey research. There's so many of us who know how to put together the questions and find the samples, and we know the flaws, and we know what we have to take into account when we confront those flaws, and what is good enough and what won't be good enough. We know how to do it. It's easy. What has not been done is the attempt to explore what the various phrases, ideas, responses mean to the people who express them. I gave you a couple of examples of that before. But the fact of the matter is, people act not only according to the superficial phrasing of what they're doing, but according to the implicit underlying plausibility structures. They need to be explored much more fully. In some cases, we want to strengthen them. In some cases, we want to try to reverse them. In some cases, we will want to explain how the implications of what people believe are much more favorable than what they themselves understand. To do anything else is to put a Band-Aid on the problem. Only that will be a way of changing the diet so that we can create stronger, better health. So we need to develop the position. We need to study in great detail what people are really thinking. We need to develop programmatic ways to convey a new framework within which we understand what we as a people are about. When we do that, we will strengthen ourselves and inspire others. Thank you.
You referred to, which I remember as a student dealing with, Marshall Sklar's primary work on
Lakeville.
Thank you. Yeah, the 93%, I think you said, that feel that social and ethical behavior, moral and ethical behavior, is essential to Judaism. But I'm wondering if we have done the other comparison from Lakeville and attachment to Jewish life, behavior in terms of Jewish life, whether it's Pesach Seder, whether it's Shabbat candles, whatever it might be, then as opposed to today, and then look at that correlation and see how different or perhaps similar that may be. What about his findings in that area that I just mentioned compared to the findings to today?
Okay. One of the things Claire did, interestingly, when he looked at rituals, which rituals are likely to hold and which rituals are likely to be set aside, he came up with a set of criteria that he believes works. One of them, he said, it has to be capable of effective redefinition in modern terms. It does not demand social isolation and the following of a unique lifestyle. It accords with the religious culture of the larger community and provides a Jewish alternative when such is felt to be needed. Those are very relevant also to the ideas that we hold. A fourth one centered on the child, and a fifth performed annually or infrequently. In other words, it's not much of a bother. What that poses, it seems to me, both in this analysis and in what he suggested, is the interplay between universalism and particularism. That's an issue, obviously, a major issue in Zionist thought. It's a major issue in both a diaspora community and Israel, that in some measure, in some ways, to some extent, in other words, it all has to be defined, wants to be different and distinctive, and at the same time wants to be part of the larger world. Charles Liebman spoke of that years ago, did a book on it, The Ambivalent American Jew. The ambivalence is we want to be like everybody else and we want to be unique and different. But I think he was right. And I think that's true not only of American Jews, that's also true to the extent that I know Israelis and read about Israel. It's also true in Israel. It's an interesting cultural issue, the degree to which we want to be distinctive and the degree to which we want to be like other people, be part of a larger world. And that becomes in many ways more urgent given new technology, availability of almost anything across any lines. That's a very challenging issue. Now, I believe that for many people whose Jewishness is thin, the degree to which they can ally themselves with non-Jews, take non-Jewish positions, be, as they see it, part of a larger world, becomes very important. And if they can do that in the name of Jewishness, that's even better. They can have their universalism. It cannot bother them. Their Jewishness cannot bother them very much. And they can do all of that in the name of their Jewishness. Now, that there are any number of internal contradictions in that, you and I understand. That the spin-off of that puts people in positions that call for logic and call for rationality, but nonetheless they're comfortable in them. We know that too. But it would seem to me, again, how do we respond to it? Probably developing a really compelling position or set of positions on the particularism, universalism issue, that from which we can then develop a series of behaviors and relationships. But as long as that is not resolved at all, or addressed only, in terms of the blast of the day, it's going to fester and get worse, it seems to me.
So your talk in general raised several questions for me, so I'm not going to try to ask any one of them with a full introduction. If they resonate for you, you can respond. And maybe in the course of other questions, I'm just going to list some of the things. Maybe not start. Sorry, I'm going to list some of the things I'm not very good at this time. First of all, I'm an American living here just on a long-term temporary basis, but I've been in academia as a librarian for 25 years. And I have seen a lot of academic stuff. And I grew up in LA, and so some of these things are very close to home. But let me go to my first question. As an academic librarian, something prompted me to think about the chain of citation problem that I see when students or faculty try to find academic, scholarly, factual writing on Israel itself, not the relationship. It almost doesn't exist because of the implicit or the unknown boycott that happens even if there's not a passage of it. It just occurred to me, I'm not sure which sentence, so it's not really a question. I wondered if you could say or think about the impact of European anti-Semitism that is rising now, in the American common wisdom or gestalt, it's always been, it can't happen here because we don't have the history. But will American Jews respond to the influx into Israel of middle-class Parisians, Bretons? Is that something that's going to change some of that non-affiliation identification? Is that a possible impact going forward? Third question, you didn't mention, or not question, but I'm raising issues. If you don't have to answer me. I'm going to sit down, and then you can think about them and answer. Intersectionality, that concept in academia and how it's spreading.
Okay.
And I just want to mention the lack of facts and the other reason it's impossible to discuss politics in America. Thank you, that's all. It's not, you don't have to answer me. Those are
Okay. No, let me answer.
Go ahead.
Okay. With regard to the kind of material that's missing, I will try to be brief because if you start me down that road, okay. What is desperately needed and what I am trying somehow or other to try to get into place is the kind of material that's in the middle. The scholarly works are available. The obvious advocacy pieces are available. There is too little of other materials being widely disseminated. This center, as a matter of fact, is leader in publishing a lot of the kinds of things that are needed and more widely distributed. With regard to Europe, what concerns me, I don't know too much about it. I mean, I know what I read in the newspapers with regard to Europe. But Europe has a reasonably good image in the informed Western world in America. And what happens in Europe almost provides a sanction. I mean, if those nice Europeans are doing it, or at least many of those nice Europeans are doing it, how bad can it be? That is difficult, again, because ideas are not simply evaluated coldly on their merits. They are evaluated within a social context, and Europe can confer a positive social context on ideas that are very dangerous. With regard to intersectionality, again, that I didn't use the term, but I think I really referred to it when I spoke of alliance building and the kind of polarization that makes it impossible, increasingly impossible, to agree on some issues and disagree on other issues. Increasingly, you're with us or you're against us, and that puts a lot of people in a very difficult position. That in the long run may be one of the most dangerous worldwide trends, the polarization that we see in so many ways and in so many places. One can argue that freedom, democracy, civility all rest on an ability to compromise, to decide what you're going to keep and what you're going to give. That fundamental attitude toward ideas and practices and laws and everything else, it would seem to me, is an absolutely necessary foundation for political civility. Intersectionality denies that. Yeah.
Mervin, thank you. Artie Geldman from Efrat. Last century, the creation of the State of Israel reestablished being Jewish as a form of national identity. And particularly in the last century, Jewish life in America, but in the Western world in general, sort of emphasized what Cohen and Eisen refer to as the sovereign self, that being Jewish is the way I define it for myself. Hillel Halkin wrote or used a very, what I find, practical, interesting metaphor of the difference between the two societies, where Israeli society, as a national expression of being Jewish, is like a billiard table with sides. And American society is like a table. And if you roll a ball on a billiard table, it gets the end, it bounces back. On a table like this, it goes off the end. Seeing how there's secular Jews in both countries, the national element, the fact that Day of Rest is Shabbat and the language is Hebrew, and the question is, I just want your comment. Do you think that the falling off the end of the table is inevitable? Because if it wasn't for the fact that this is the state of Israel with those laws built into our social structure, secular Jews here might also just fall off the end. Is it inevitable in the long run?
Anybody who says that anything is inevitable is taking a serious risk. It does seem to me that, you see, things are always the same and they're always unique and different. And it's striking that balance that becomes crucial, it seems to me. If the only thing that unites the Jews is the word Jew, we're finished. So many will fall off there will always be Jews, but it'll be a small, active, energetic little community somewhere of interest to anthropology graduate students. It has to mean more than just the name. What do we have in common? What unites us? Sociologists often try to find what is the real case, but theoreticians, philosophers, religious leaders, sometimes even sociologists and historians, try to pinpoint what ought to be. What is it aside from the name and the past? If it's only the past, it has no future. But if there is something of continuing, compelling significance that unites us, then we can also define the variation that can tolerate, both in practice and reality and in theory. That is not easy to do, but it seems to me necessary to do, because the social ties that used to bind are inevitably going to get weaker and weaker. Technology will weaken them, if nothing else. The ability to move around will weaken them, if nothing else. In effect, there is no such thing as a community anymore. I mean, the people that you used to stand online in the grocery with, they become irrelevant because both they and we are on our cell phones talking to people miles away. The news that we get, the ways in which we can seek information, the technology itself is not just weakening community. We don't know how, but it is going to restructure the way in which people relate to one another. It is a fundamental difference in kind that we are trying to anticipate. Now, that's going to have enormous impact on Jewish life as well. If the only thing that unites us is a name, an identity, then we will be subject to all of the ills and maladies that we're dealing with, including the one that's today's agenda. And in the end, there will be a weakening because it won't be compelling, it won't be commanding, it won't be enough. And if it becomes troublesome, instead of pulling together, we will run. If, however, we can find what unites, both in time and in place, then we can also see what that implies for reasonable variation. Unfortunately, that conversation is going, it seems to me, inevitably to be muddied up by mixed motivation, all kinds of other concerns. Our political interests, our alliances, our need to hold our coalitions together, because if it's the leaders who do it, they have to hold their coalitions together. And as I pointed out, I mean not only the prime minister. But that, it seems to me, is what we have to do. And that will help us to define both the content of the unity and the appropriate, reasonable range of diversity. Because it's the range that matters. It's not an argument of pluralism versus monolithic approach. Nobody has no group that I know has a monolithic approach. Everybody's pluralist. The question is where you draw the lines. That's what the argument is really over. What are the lines? Now, if there are no lines, then there is no content. If there are lines and we argue over what the lines are, those lines define the content and they define the tolerable diversity. It's going to be an enormous challenge, but it would seem to me we have no alternative.
How do you explain the worldwide decline in religious observance, not just among Jews, but it seems to be a worldwide phenomenon?
Yeah, on the other hand, what was predicted in the... On the other hand, what was predicted in the middle of the 20th century isn't happening, at least not in America, from what I can tell in the Western world. Marshall Sclair, who was as competent a sociologist as you can get, predicted that orthodoxy would seriously decline from generation to generation. It was the grandparents' movement, and we all knew that. When I was starting out in sociology, we all understood that. Well, it's not happening. Go into any American community, the average age will be lowest in the Orthodox shul. The conservative movement is now the oldest of the movements in terms of its membership. Orthodoxy still represents about 9 or 10% of American Jews, but if you take people under 40 who belong to synagogues, any synagogue, it goes up to about 35%. And children in any kind of Jewish education, again, 30, 40%. I mean, Orthodoxy has both numbers and vigor and a cultural prominence that nobody expected. But the same thing is happening in the Christian world. It used to be that, the mainline denominations, and then you had those crazy evangelicals. For the last 15 years or so, every poll has shown that there are more evangelicals than mainliners. They're becoming the middle. In the Islamic world, the idea of, going for it now, rather than, waiting until God gives you your chance in some distant future. There were always people who believed that, but they were a few crazy people, and the rest of the Muslims sat on them and, kept them down. Well, now they own a couple of governments, and they threaten us all. I'm not sure. Now, it may be that what you have here is, again, a polarization. People, by the way, the Jewish data show that in the United States, that the middle is emptying out. If you do a kind of ritual scale, you ask about 11 rituals, so you can score between 0 and 11. The later the study, the higher the proportions at the extremes, and the lower the proportions in the middle. Same thing about Jewish education. The Hebrew schools, the Sunday schools are consolidating and closing. The yeshivas are blossoming, and kids who learn nothing or just learn how to, not make fools of themselves when they're bar mitzvah. That's growing. In almost every measure, people who are involved in a whole bunch of organizations and give a lot of money, growing. People whom you can't get anything from, growing. In other words, in almost all measures, the extremes are growing. Now, the low extreme is growing more quickly. And in that sense, you're right. But it's really a polarization that's occurring. More and more of the studies, as a matter of fact, whether one likes it or not, are separating out the Orthodox from the others. More studies, you say, well, our sample is so many non-Orthodox Jews, or comparing the Orthodox with everybody else. Two different patterns of approach are emerging in studies of American Jewish life. Now, again, keep in mind, I'm not saying that, the Orthodox movement has it right. That suggests that it's the cause. It may be the consequence. That people who want to live thicker Jewish lives, more intensive Jewish lives, more central Jewish lives, just find it easier and find more company in Orthodox circles. In other words, the movement you choose may not cause you to have the kind of Jewish identity you have. The kind of Jewish identity you have will make you more comfortable here, here, or here. So I'm not saying it's cause. It may be consequence. But the difference statistically is clear, study after study after study. That is consistent. I mean, give or take a couple of points this way or that way, same thing.
I want to ask two questions. First, I didn't hear the word intermarriage, and I'd like to ask about the impact of intermarriage. We all know, we all have it in family, we all see it,
Yeah.
and what is your view of that, and on the diaspora-Israel relationship? how does intermarriage affect it?
Sure.
The other is the radical left and its influence as well. I remember being of that generation where people who were radically leftist and joined all these Black Power or tried to do the civil rights movement, go one further than the civil rights movement, were rejected by the African Americans, and then they became, their leftism did it veer to pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel, and what is the impact of those people?
Sure.
And if there are people who are really interested in discord, I'm not a conspiracy theory kind of people, it's not a hidden hand, but there are people who live for that kind of lahachis kind of stuff, and they seem to be more and more of them, and unfortunately, this is my view, many of them seem to be in Jewish studies too. Okay.
Okay, yeah. Yes. Intermarriage. I remember when the intermarriage phenomenon suddenly shot up in the mid-20th century, and some of the first studies were reported. Those who were hoping, were saying, well, if we can at least keep at least 50% of the kids, we're okay. Just statistically speaking, we're not keeping 50% of the kids, except in Boston. I don't know quite why, but the Boston figures are better. Other than that, it's more like a quarter to a third. Here's the point, though. We're beginning to see the next generation now. And the Jewishly identifying children of intermarriage, that is, children of intermarried parents who themselves identify as Jewish, in turn intermarry at a rate of 75 to 80%. Well, their parents did. They don't see the problem. No, it's part of the salad bar. It's one of the things you can do. And Jewishness gets defined as an individual identity, an individual, just the way a Korean can marry an Irish, an Italian, why not? It's a few things you do. It's a little bit of your culture. It's some foods you eat, a song, a nice quotation, and a few memories of a grandparent. If that's what it amounts to, it is perfectly compatible with intermarriage. But the rate shows a rapid decline in the following generation. The other finding that we know is that even though Jewishly identifying children of intermarriage and their parents are similar in their religious practices with liberal religious Jews, that is, they tend to follow the standard range of practices in the Reform movement, what they are much weaker in is their notion of Jewish peoplehood. Identity with other Jews, feeling of responsibility for Jewish fate abroad, ties to Israel. That is, all of the social links are weaker even when the religious practices are similar. They become weaker a generation later. So in a way, the statistics suggest a serious falling off, if not immediately, certainly a generation or two down the road. And a number of studies have been done specifically separating out people who intermarry and people who don't. And the differences are dramatic, much lower on all measures of Jewish involvement. So yes, many of them continue to identify as Jews, but much less compellingly, much less urgently, much less pervasively, and a generation later, it's almost gone. With regard to the radical left, it would seem that Jews are most endangered by the radical anything. It's the extremists that always hurt us. In America, there's often the argument, who's better for the Jews, the left or the right? And the answer is the left and the right are usually both fine for the Jews. The far left and the far right are going to be dangerous for the Jews. But that's true not only politically, that's also true religiously. It was the radical religious folks that burned us at the stake, or that marched people out onto the beach and slit their throats. Extremism, radicalism of all sorts, it would seem over the course of history, is not good for Jews. Why that is the case, and so that's subject of a different paper. I'm only starting to work on that one. But the fact is that does seem to be the lesson of history. It's not the left, it's not the right, it's not the religious, it's not the secularists. It's the radical left, it's the radical right, it's the radical religious, and it's the radical secularists who always pose serious dangers to the Jews. Others are beginning to see that people who take extreme radical positions can be dangerous not only to Jews but to others as well. The difficulty with that is that in a world that gets polarized, where you don't want to compromise and be civil and yield, where you want to stand for principle, the radicals make the best speeches. I mean, they're eloquent, they're forthright, they're not compromising, they're standing for the truth. There's something very attractive like that in a world that's reacting to some of the excesses of relativism. So it's more dangerous today, perhaps, also because the weaponry is so much more severe today. But yeah, it's not just the radical left; it's the radical left that.
In the beginning of your speech, you mentioned something about Pew research being one of the best ones, and then you gave some examples of the questions, and I had trouble. I saw what you were immediately saying. I had trouble figuring out really what the questions meant, and I have a feeling that most of the surveys, whether it's Pew or some of the other surveys that I read about, do not have proper questions that people can't make a mistake. Are you for X or are you for Y? And it doesn't ask you that.
Yeah, look.
So can you comment a little
sure,
bit
sure.
about surveys? Thank
Yeah. You know, part of what I do in my day job is surveys, put together surveys. So I understand the difficulty of getting them right. But you can get them right. The problem with any survey is a preliminary step is often not done. Namely, exactly how do you read this? What does this mean to you? The person writing it knows, and it may be very neutral in its phrasing, and so we're willing to use it. To do that kind of extra step, frankly, is very costly, and the people who fund research are often not willing to do it. But it would seem to me we have to undertake that, because we have to know not only what people say to this or to that question, but exactly what they mean by it. Because at the end of the day, it's the framing context that shapes behavior. So, I mean, you're right. You see, there are always two questions when you undertake a research project. The first is, what is the best way to do it? The second is, now that we know the best way to do it, is it good enough to be worth doing? Right?
First of all, I want to commend you on a very interesting lecture.
Thanks.
Comprehensive, as usual. My question is, you asked for maybe some ideas to complement your ideas, and that is, you were talking about the social justice, which is so common to American Jewry. Maybe one of the problems we have now with American Jewry is that we are successful. In other words, it's easier to support the poor nephew who is, the Alte Heim in Poland, where we were miskenim, and especially Six-Day War, we're almost destroyed. So it fits into your ideology of social justice. I remember that after the Six-Day War, when it started criticism from the West, Dosh had a very interesting caricature, and it said, "Sorry, we won." Mm-hmm. Okay? And maybe now, and I can say it because I lived in America, and when I came back, it was still very much behind. But today, especially with Amazon, and you can buy everything through Amazon now on the net, we are a success story. And for American Jewry, now, if you want to look for some social justice, okay, it's easier the Palestinians and maybe some Africans, poor Africans, and so on. And the Jews now are looking for some, and that's why I think they can't more identify so much with us, especially when we have to do certain things which are don't fit into their.
Right, yeah. Thank you, Shmuel. You're right, but you see, I would make the case, and when somebody gives me the opportunity on campuses, I try, that if you're going to stand for social justice, and that term has any significant meaning, you'll wind up supporting Israel. That in part, the use of social justice now gets tied up, tangled up, muddied up by alliances, by intersectionality, by the need for company, by a lack of knowledge and understanding. Again, kids who grew up knowing only a successful, powerful Israel. All of that comes together, and their understanding of social justice, I would argue, is seriously flawed. First, the way they define social justice, namely as automatically supporting the underdog and whom is perceived as weak. A distrust of power, which, if you're going to bring about social justice, you're going to have to use power correctly, not ignore it, and so on and so on. And in other words, I think you're right. But it's not just because of the idea of social justice. I think it's because of the intersectionality and the social support and the alliances. All of that tangles it up. And part of what we have to do, again, when we make the compelling case, we can't say we're against social justice. That first of all, we aren't. It would be wrong both in content and as a strategy. But we have to redefine it and explain it and try to disentangle it from its current political uses.
Do you think that the rise of anti-Semitic incidents in the United States and even in Europe could strengthen the link between Jews in America?
Between Jews and America?
Could it also strengthen Jewish identity as well?
I'm not sure, but I doubt it. In other words, there's a notion that external pressure creates internal solidarity, and that's frequently heard. I think external pressure creates internal solidarity under two circumstances. Number one, there's no escape. You have no choice but to try to pull together. The second is that even though you can escape, you believe that hanging on is so overwhelmingly worthwhile that you do it anyhow. As long as there's an escape, that is an option. And I suspect many people will choose it. History does have precedence. So I would not count on it. And first of all, I don't want to have the strength of the Jewish community dependent on anti-Semitism. Secondly, even if I were willing to do it, I doubt that it would succeed in a free world in which it is easy to become a none of the above.